The wind blows across the rocky hills of the Peloponnese. It is a warm, dry wind carrying the scent of wild thyme and the salt of the Aegean Sea. Today, if you stand on the citadel of Mycenae, looking out over the fertile plains of Argos, you see a landscape of peace. You see olive groves shimmering silver in the heat. You see small villages nestled in the valleys. You see the enduring, quiet beauty of Greece. But if you look down at your feet, at the stones that form the foundations of the ancient walls, you're looking at a crime scene. You're standing at the edge of a great precipice in human history. History is usually a story of slow progression, one stone placed upon another, one idea building on the next. But sometimes the story breaks. Sometimes the lights simply go out. This is the story of the greatest blackout in the ancient world. Between the years 1200 and 800 BCE, the civilization of Bronze Age Greece did not just decline, it vanished. It is a period that historians and archaeologists have long called the Dark Ages. For 3 centuries, the grandeur of the Mediterranean world, the world of high palaces, international trade, and complex bureaucracy, disintegrated into shadow. Imagine for a moment what was lost. Before 1200 BCE, this land was loud. It was the sound of bronze hammers striking anvils. It was the sound of chariots rattling over paved roadways. It was the sound of scribes scratching records into soft clay tablets, tallying the immense wealth of kings. It was a world of monumental architecture, where engineers diverted rivers and built walls so massive that later generations believe they must have been stacked by giants. And then silence. Within the span of a single lifetime, the great palaces were burned to the ground. The kings vanished. The engineers disappeared. The trade ships that crisscrossed the wine-dark sea, carrying ivory from Egypt and copper from Cyprus, stopped sailing. The population of Greece plummeted, perhaps by as much as 90%. Cities that had bustled with thousands of people were abandoned to the wind and the weeds. But the most chilling loss was not the gold or the masonry. It was the voice of the people. The Greeks of the Bronze Age had a writing system we call Linear B. It was a script of administration, used to track the flow of wool, grain, and weapons. But after the collapse, the ability to write this script disappeared. Think about the magnitude of that loss. It wasn't just that books were burned. It was that the very technology of writing was forgotten. For 300 years, Greece was illiterate. The memory of the past was no longer recorded in clay or stone. It hung by the fragile thread of the spoken word, passed from the lips of one storyteller to the ear of another, around campfires in the ruins of a broken world. For centuries, historians looked at this gap in the timeline and saw nothing but a void. It was a blank space on the map of time, a period of poverty, isolation, and cultural amnesia. But archaeology is the art of listening to the quiet. And when we listen closely to these 300 years, we do not hear a void. We hear a whisper. We find the story in the dirt. We find it in the shards of pottery that shifted from the elegant, naturalistic scenes of the palace era to simple geometric patterns, circles and lines drawn by hands that had forgotten how to paint faces, but still sought to bring order to chaos. We find it in the layers of ash that mark the end of the great citadels, and in the humble, unfortified villages that sprang up in the hills above them. We find it in the rusted iron blades that began to replace the gleaming bronze swords of the ancestors. This documentary is an investigation into those lost centuries. It is a detective story played out over 3,000 years. We are piecing together a world that fell apart, trying to understand how a civilization as sophisticated as the Mycenaeans could simply cease to be. Was it an invasion of mysterious sea peoples, swooping down from the north like a storm? Was it a catastrophe of the earth itself, a storm of earthquakes that shattered the palace walls? Was it a rebellion from within, a rising of the hungry against the rich? Or was it something more complex, a systemic failure of an economy that had grown too brittle to survive a changing world. We may never know for certain. The people who lived through the collapse left us no diaries, they left us no histories, they left us only ruins and silence. But there is a paradox in this darkness, a strange and beautiful contradiction that lies at the heart of our journey tonight. If you look closely at the Dark Age, you realise that it was not merely a grave, it was a womb. In the poverty and isolation of these centuries, stripped of the oppressive bureaucracy of the palace kings, the Greek spirit was being reshaped. It was in this darkness that the iron of the Greek character was forged. It was in these illiterate centuries that the greatest oral poems in history, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed, refining the legends of a golden past into the bedrock of Western literature. It was in the absence of kings that the radical idea of the polis, the city-state, began to germinate. The darkness gave birth to the light. The collapse of the Bronze Age made way for the rise of classical Greece. Without the catastrophe of 1200 BCE, there would be no Parthenon, no Socrates, no democracy. So, as you settle in, let go of the modern world. Let the lights of your own room fade. Imagine the sun setting over the Aegean 3,000 years ago. The great citadels are silent. The scribes have fled. The ships are gone. The night is coming. But in the darkness there are survivors, and they have a story to tell. This is the story of the Greek Dark Ages. To understand the darkness, we must first understand the light that was extinguished. We must wind the clock back, moving from the silence of the ruins to the roar of a living civilization. Let us travel back to the year 1250 BCE. We are standing in the same landscape, but the world feels fundamentally different. The hillsides are terraced and tamed, the roads are paved and patrolled, and on the high ridges, looming over the valleys like stone crowns, stand the great palaces of the Mycenaeans. This is the late Bronze Age. It is a time of immense heavy splendour. If you were a traveller arriving at the citadel of Mycenae in this era, you would not be met with a ruin. You would be met with an assertion of absolute power. As you approach the main entrance, you pass through the famous Lion Gate. Above the massive lintel stone, two limestone lions stand facing each other, their paws resting on a pillar. It is the first piece of monumental sculpture in Europe. It is a warning and a welcome, declaring that a powerful king, a Wonax, rules here. Inside the walls, the air is filled with the smells of a thriving industry. Perfumed oil being bottled for export, wool being dyed purple, bronze being smelted in hot furnaces. You walk up the winding ramps past workshops and storerooms until you reach the heart of the palace, the Megaron. This is the throne room. In our modern imagination, we often picture ancient ruins as white and austere, but the Bronze Age was a world of riotous colour. The walls of the Megaron are covered in frescoes painted in vivid blues, deep reds, and ochres. They depict scenes of the hunt, of dolphins leaping in the sea, of women in flounced skirts bearing gifts. In the centre of the room is a great circular hearth, the spiritual centre of the kingdom. 4 wooden columns surround it, and the smoke drifts up through an opening in the roof to the Greek sky. On a throne to the right sits the Wonax, the High King, controlling a network of power that stretches across the Mediterranean. This civilization was not just about stone and gold. It was defined by something much more modern and perhaps much more fragile: bureaucracy. The Mycenaeans were obsessed with order. We know this because they left behind thousands of documents. They didn't write histories or poems, they wrote lists. They used the script we call Linear B, scratching it into damp clay tablets that were then dried in the sun. When archaeologists deciphered these tablets in the 1950s, they didn't find the wisdom of philosophers. They found the meticulous obsession of accountants. One tablet from the Palace of Pylos lists the contents of a storeroom: 3 tripods, 1 tripod with 2 handles, 2 wine jars. Another lists the exact number of sheep in a specific flock, down to the single animal. Another records the rations of figs and grain given to groups of female workers. This tells us something crucial about the Bronze Age world. It was a command economy. The palace controlled everything. It collected the goods from the countryside, stored them in massive magazines and redistributed them. It was a pyramid of total control, with the one-axe at the apex and the scribes acting as the nervous system, tracking every sword, every wheel, and every liter of oil. But this system didn't exist in a vacuum. The Mycenaeans were part of a vast, interconnected global economy. In 1250 BCE, the Mediterranean was as connected as the modern world is today. A diplomatic letter could be sent from the pharaoh of Egypt to the king of the Hittites in Anatolia. A merchant ship could set sail from the coast of Lebanon, stop in Cyprus to load copper ingots, dock in Crete, and finally unload its treasures in Mycenae. We have found the physical proof of this connection beneath the waves. The shipwreck at Uluburun, dating to this exact period, contained a cargo that reads like a grocery list for a civilization. Ivory from hippopotamuses, amber from the Baltic Sea, glass from Canaan, ebony wood from Africa, and tons of copper and tin. This interdependence was the engine of their wealth. The Mycenaeans needed tin from arguably as far away as Afghanistan to mix with copper to create bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. Without this long-distance trade, their weapons would be brittle and their tools would be soft. They were wealthy, powerful, and utterly dependent on a supply chain that spanned the known world. And what did they do with this bronze? They built a machine of war. The Mycenaeans were a warrior culture, unlike the Minoans on Crete, who built open palaces with airy courtyards. The Mycenaeans built fortresses. Their art celebrates combat. We find daggers inlaid with scenes of men hunting lions. We find full suits of bronze armour, heavy and clunky, looking almost like walking tanks. They wore helmets made from the tusks of boars. To make a single helmet, a hunter had to kill dozens of wild boars, a testament to prowess and violence. This is the world that Homer would later remember, centuries after it had turned to dust. When the poet sings of Mycenae rich in gold, or Pylos the sandy, he is preserving a dim, distorted memory of this specific time. The Trojan War, if it has a kernel of historical truth, happened here in these final frantic decades of the 13th century BCE. The legendary figures of Achilles, Agamemnon and Odysseus are ghosts of these Bronze Age warlords. They lived in a time when men felt like giants, when the walls were high and the gods seemed to walk among them. It was a golden age. It was a time of stability, where a scribe could spend his entire life recording the movements of flax and bronze, confident that the palace would stand forever. But complexity has a price. The more intricate a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is. The Mycenaean world was a masterpiece of engineering and administration, a clockwork mechanism of thousands of moving parts. The kings on their thrones surrounding by, their frescoes and their gold must have felt invincible. They could look out from their citadels and see a world that was ordered, accounted for and tamed. They did not know that they were standing on a house of cards. They did not know that the wind was about to change. As we move toward the year 1200 BCE, we can almost feel the tension rising. The tablets begin to show signs of anxiety. We find references to Watchers of the Coast. We see preparations for a siege. The golden memory is about to be tarnished. The clockwork is about to break. The peak has been reached. Now comes the fall. The year is roughly 1200 BCE. To the casual observer, the sun still rises over the Aegean with the same brilliance it always has. The galleys still row into the harbours of Pylos and Tiryns, their holds heavy with scented oil and flax. The kings still sit on their thrones, surrounded by the bright frescoes of dolphins and griffins, confident that the walls built by their ancestors will stand for eternity. But if you listen closely to the archaeological record, you can hear the sound of the wind changing. It is a subtle shift at first, a slight disruption in the arrival of tin from the east, a bad harvest that leaves the granaries half empty, a tremor in the earth that cracks the plaster of a storeroom. These seem like small things, the ordinary troubles of a complex world, but they are the first tremors of an avalanche that is about to bury the Bronze Age. We're approaching the moment of the catastrophe. This is not just a Greek story. To understand why the lights went out in Mycenae, we must look at the horizon. We must realise that the fire that consumed Greece was part of a conflagration that scorched the entire eastern Mediterranean. Imagine a map of the ancient world. In 1200 BCE, it is a network of bright lights. There is the new kingdom of Egypt, powerful and wealthy under the pharaohs. There is the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the great rivals of Egypt, masters of iron and chariots. There are the rich trading cities of the Levant, like Ugarit, the Venice of the ancient world, where merchants speak a dozen languages on the docks, and there are the Mycenaeans in Greece. Within a span of just 50 years, a single heartbeat in the vast scale of history, almost all of these lights will be extinguished. The Hittite capital of Hattuser is burned and abandoned, its archives of clay tablets left to bake in the fire of its destruction. The great city of Ugarit is destroyed so thoroughly that it will never be inhabited again. The Egyptian empire fights for its life, repelling waves of invaders, but retreating into a shell from which it will not emerge for centuries. And the palaces of Greece fall, one by one. How did it happen? How did a civilization so strong, so interconnected and so technologically advanced simply collapse? This is the central mystery of the Dark Ages. It is a cold case file that is 3,000 years old. Archaeologists and historians have spent decades sifting through the ashes, looking for the weapon, looking for the motive, looking for the culprit. They have found many suspects. The first, and perhaps the most famous, are the mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. They appear in the records of the Egyptians like ghosts out of the mist. In the great relief carvings at the Temple of Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Rames III describes a confederation of warriors who came from the north, from the midst of the sea. He names them the Peliset, the Tcheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian. The Egyptian carvings depict them as distinct from the known armies of the time. Some wear feathered headdresses, others wear horned helmets. They travel not just in warships, but with ox carts carrying their women and children, suggesting a migration, a desperate movement of an entire people seeking a new home. For a long time, historians believed these sea peoples were the sole cause of the collapse, a barbarian horde that swept down and smashed the brittle civilizations of the Bronze Age. We imagine them burning the ships at anchor, storming the citadels, and leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. There is a haunting letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, written by a desperate king to the king of Cyprus. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. The tablet was found in a kiln, apparently thrown there to be baked before it could be sent. It was never delivered. The city fell before the mail could leave. But modern archaeology suggests that the Sea Peoples, while terrifying, may not have been the root cause. They may have been a symptom. Were they conquerors, or were they refugees? Were they the arsonists who set the world on fire, or were they fleeing a fire that had already started further north? This brings us to the second suspect, the Earth itself. The Bronze Age collapse coincides with a period of intense seismic activity. Geologists call it an earthquake storm. Greece sits on a web of fault lines. Excavations at Mycenae and Tiryns show skeletons crushed under fallen masonry that dates to this specific window of time. Walls that had stood for centuries were suddenly twisted and broken. Imagine the psychological terror of this. The Mycenaeans were a deeply religious people. They believed their kings were divinely ordained. If the earth shakes and the Cyclopean walls crumble, it is not just a structural failure, it is a theological crisis. It is a sign that the gods have turned their backs, but earthquakes alone rarely end a civilization. Humans are resilient. We rebuild. We pick up the stones and stack them again. There must have been something else, something that weakened the population so much that they could not lift the stones. We look to the sky. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment cores from the Mediterranean suggest that around 1200 BCE, the climate shifted. A mega drought, lasting perhaps 3 centuries, settled over the region. The rain stopped. The wheat withered in the fields of Mycenae. The sheep, recorded so meticulously by the scribes, began to die. In a palace economy, the king's legitimacy is tied to his ability to feed his people. The farmers give their grain to the palace, and the palace redistributes it. But what happens when the granaries are empty? What happens when the scribe records a 0? This leads us to the third suspect, the enemy within. As hunger spreads, the bond between the ruler and the ruled begins to fray. The massive walls of the citadels were built to keep enemies out, but they also kept the wealth in. If you were a starving farmer living in the shadow of the palace, watching the smoke of sacrifices rise while your children cried for bread, those walls might start to look less like protection and more like a prison. Some archaeologists interpret the burn layers at Mycenaean sites not as the result of foreign invasion, but of internal uprising. The fires often seem to start in the administrative centres, the archives, the storerooms. It is the destruction of the system itself. It is the burning of the tax records. And yet, none of these theories, invaders, earthquakes, drought, or rebellion, seem sufficient on its own. A strong empire can fight off pirates. It can rebuild after a quake. It can import grain during a drought. It can suppress a revolt. The most compelling explanation, the one that scholars lean toward today, is perhaps the most frightening because it is the most modern. It is the theory of systems collapse. Think of the Bronze Age world not as a collection of separate kingdoms, but as a single, complex machine. It was a globalized economy just like ours. The Mycenaeans needed Hittite markets. The Hittites needed Egyptian grain. They all needed Cypriot copper and Afghan tin. It was a house of cards. When the Bronze Age worked, it was magnificent. It produced art and wealth on a scale never before seen. But it was hyper-specialized. Imagine the dominoes falling. A drought in Anatolia destabilizes the Hittite Empire. The Hittites can no longer police their seas. Pirates, the sea peoples, begin to raid the shipping lanes. The flow of tin acts as a bottleneck. Without tin, you cannot make bronze weapons to defend yourself. The trade routes are cut. The merchant ships stop coming to Pylos. The palace workshops run out of raw materials. The craftsmen have no work. The economy grinds to a halt. Then the earthquake hits. Then the hungry peasants riot. Then the raiders appear on the horizon. It is a perfect storm. The system was too efficient, too interconnected, and too brittle to survive a cascade of failures. We can see the panic of these final days in the artifacts themselves. At the Palace of Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, archaeologists found a set of linear B tablets that feel like a voice screaming from the grave. They are not the usual lists of sheep or wool. They are emergency military orders. One tablet details the urgent dispatch of watchers to the coast. The command of the watchers, it reads, listing the names of officers sent to guard the shoreline. Another tablet orders the collection of bronze from the temples, literally stripping the metal from the shrines to forge spear points. It is a desperate act of sacrilege and survival. They knew something was coming. They stood on the ramparts of Pylos, scanning the grey horizon of the Ionian Sea, waiting for the sails to appear. They did not have to wait long. Pylos was burned. The fire was so intense that it turned the clay tablets into ceramic, preserving the king's final panic for 3,000 years. The palace was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned, eventually becoming lost to memory until the spade of the archaeologist uncovered it in the 20th century. The collapse was swift. By 1150 BCE, The great centres of Mycenae, Tiryns and Thebes were smoking ruins. The population did not just die, they scattered. The complex social structure with its kings, generals, priests and scribes evaporated. The survivors fled. They abandoned the fertile plains that were too easy for raiders to access. They moved to the mountains, to the islands, to places of refuge. They took only what they could carry. They left behind the potter's wheel. They left behind the fresco pigments. And most tragically, they left behind the knowledge of writing. As the fires burned down to embers, a great silence descended on Greece. The global economy was gone. The world shrank. A man who had once bought oil from Crete and swords from Syria now lived in a world that ended at the nearest hill. The Bronze Age was over. The palaces were now just skeletons of stone, blackened by fire, standing watch over a depopulated land. The wind blew through the empty megarons, whistling past the pillars, where kings had once poured libations to the gods. The sun set on the heroic age, and the long night began. The fires of Pylos and Mycenae have burned themselves out. The smoke that blackened the Aegean sky has finally drifted away. The shouting of the raiders and the screams of the dying have faded into a terrifying silence. We are now in the year 1150 BCE. We have crossed the threshold into the first true phase of the Dark Ages. It is a world of aftermath. Imagine standing on a hillside in the Peloponnese, looking down at the valley where a great palace once stood. A generation ago, that valley was a hive of activity. Chariots, merchants, soldiers. Now it is a graveyard of stone. The roof timbers of the Megaron have collapsed. Weeds are already growing through the cracks in the paved courtyards. The colourful frescoes, once the pride of kings, are peeling in the sun and rain, dissolving into dust. But where are the people? The most striking feature of the early Dark Ages is the emptiness. The archaeological record suggests a catastrophic depopulation. It is estimated that within a few decades of the collapse, the population of Greece fell by as much as 75 to 90%. Those who survived the violence, the famine and the plague did not stay in the valleys. The open plains, once the source of agricultural wealth, were now dangerous zones, exposed to anyone who might land a ship on the coast. So, the survivors ran for the hills. We see a dramatic shift in settlement patterns. People abandoned the unfortified towns that had clustered around the palaces. They moved to remote, defensible locations, high plateaus, rocky outcrops and hidden ravines. They clustered together in small, isolated villages, far from the sea that had once brought them wealth, but now brought only danger. The world shrank. In the Bronze Age, a Greek might have known of Egypt, Cyprus and Anatolia. Now, his world ended at the edge of his village. The global economy had evaporated. There were no more ships bringing ivory or gold. There was no more central authority to distribute grain. And in this isolation, a great forgetting began. The most profound loss of this period was the loss of technology. We often think of technological progress as a straight line, always moving forward. But history shows us that knowledge can be lost. It can slip through our fingers like sand. The monumental stonemasonry of the Mycenaeans, the ability to cut and move multi-ton blocks, was forgotten. The engineers who knew the mathematics of the Tholos tombs died, and no one took their place. The hydraulic systems that diverted rivers silted up and failed, but the silence was deepest in the loss of the written word. As we discussed, Linear B was a script of the palace. It was a tool for the elite, used by a small guild of professional scribes to track the complex tax system of the Wanacs. It was not used to write poetry. It was not used to write letters to grandmothers. It was used to count. When the palaces burned, the bureaucracy burned with them. The Wanacs was dead. There were no more taxes to collect. There were no more armies to provision. And so, there was no reason to write. The scribes, stripped of their purpose and their patronage, either died or returned to the fields to survive. They did not teach their apprentices. Within one generation, perhaps 40 years, the knowledge of reading and writing vanished completely from the Greek world. Think of what that means. A society that had been literate for centuries suddenly became mute. Laws could no longer be written down. Contracts could not be signed. The past could no longer be recorded. For the next 400 years, Greece would not write a single word. We can see the psychological trauma of this collapse in the pottery. Archaeologists use pottery as a clock. The style of a pot tells you exactly when and where you are in history. In the Bronze Age, pottery was elegant, standardised and mass-produced, often decorated with beautiful scenes of octopuses or flowers. But in the years immediately following 1200 BCE, the style changes abruptly. We enter the period known as sub-Mycenaean. It is a heartbreaking style. The pots are handmade or turned on slow wheels. The clay is often poorly refined. The firing is uneven, but it is the decoration that tells the saddest story. The beautiful octopuses and warriors are gone. In their place are wavy lines sloppily drawn, simple triangles, crude squiggles. It looks like the work of a civilization that is exhausted. It is the art of people who are no longer concerned with beauty, but only with utility. It is the art of survival. I need a bowl to hold my gruel, the potter seems to say. I do not have time to make it beautiful. And yet life continued. If we were to walk into a Greek village in the year 1100 BCE, what would we see? We would see a life stripped to its bare essentials. The houses are no longer multi-storey stone buildings with plumbing. They are small, one-room huts with mud brick walls and thatched roofs. They are apsidal, rounded at one end, a simpler shape that is easier to build without specialised skills. The floor is packed earth. In the centre is a simple hearth, the source of heat and light, and the place where the family cooks their meagre meals. The social structure has reverted to something ancient and tribal. There is no one axe, there is no high king. Instead, each village is led by a basileus. In the Bronze Age tablets, a kassiriou, the root of basileus, was a low-level official, a local foreman. But with the high kings gone, these local big men were the only authority left. The basileus of the Dark Age was not a god-king. He was a chieftain. He was likely the man with the most land, the most goats, and the strongest sons. He lived in a house that was only slightly larger than his neighbours. He worked the fields alongside them. It was a life of subsistence. You grew barley and wheat. You kept goats and sheep for milk and wool. You raided your neighbours for cattle. It was a violent, hard scrabble. Existence. Eerily similar to the post-apocalyptic worlds we imagine in our own fiction. But amidst this regression, a new technology was slowly emerging. Not by choice, but by necessity. The Bronze Age was named after the alloy of copper and tin. Copper was available in Cyprus, but tin had to be imported from vast distances. When the trade routes collapsed, the tin stopped coming. The Greeks could no longer make bronze. They had to find a substitute, and so they turned to iron. Iron ore is difficult to work with. It requires much higher temperatures to smelt than copper. It cannot be cast in moulds like bronze. It must be hammered and folded, beaten into shape by a blacksmith. Initially, iron weapons were inferior to bronze. They rusted. They lost their edge. But iron had one supreme advantage. The ore was everywhere. You could dig it out of the Greek hills. You didn't need a trade ship from Afghanistan to make a spearhead. The transition to the Iron Age was not a discovery of a superior metal. It was the adoption of a poverty metal. It was the technological equivalent of scavenging. But over these dark centuries, the Greek smiths would master the difficult art of ironworking. They would learn to quench and temper the metal, eventually creating weapons that were harder and sharper than anything the Bronze Age heroes had wielded. The darkness was teaching them resilience. And there is one other thing that survived the fire. Something invisible, yet stronger than stone. The voice. The scribes were gone, but the storytellers remained. In the evenings, as the villagers gathered around the fire of the basileus, wearing rough wool and eating goat meat, they did not want to hear about their own small, hard lives. They wanted to hear about the time of the giants. They wanted to hear about the golden city of Troy. They wanted to hear about the rage of Achilles and the cunning of Odysseus. They wanted to hear about the great fleet of 1,000 ships that once sailed the sea. The oral tradition became the ark of Greek culture. Bards, playing simple lyres, memorized thousands of lines of verse. They preserved the memory of the Mycenaean world, but they filtered it through the lens of the Dark Age. When Homer describes the palace of Odysseus, he describes it as having a dirt floor and smoky rafters, more like the hut of a Dark Age chieftain than a Bronze Age palace. He gives his heroes iron tools, even though they lived in the Bronze Age. He creates a hybrid world, a layering of memory and current reality. These stories were the glue that held the scattered Greek people together. They were the reminder that they were not just isolated farmers in mud huts. They were the descendants of heroes. They were Hellenes. Even in death, the culture shifted. The elaborate tholos tombs, the beehive domes of the Mycenaean elite were abandoned. In the Dark Ages, people were buried in simple cist graves, stone-lined boxes in the ground. The grave goods were few. A single iron pin, a modest pot. It suggests a society that had levelled out. The immense gap between the super-rich and the super-poor had vanished. Everyone was poor together. As the year 1050 BCE approaches, the shock of the collapse has settled into a grim new normal. The population has stabilised at a low level. The villages have established a rhythm of survival. The grand bureaucracy is forgotten, replaced by the personal rule of the chieftain. The first dark centuries were a time of trauma. But the patient was still alive. The heart was beating faintly in the hills, and deep in the soil of this impoverished world, the seeds of the future were waiting for the rain. The deepest darkness is still to come, but the Greeks have survived the fall. We have now descended to the very bottom of the curve. The year is 1050 BCE. We are a century and a half removed from the burning of the palaces. To the people living in this time, the Bronze Age is no longer a memory. It is a myth. The ruins on the hilltops are now ancient, overgrown with ivy, their purpose forgotten, attributed to a race of monsters or giants who must have piled the stones by magic. This period, from 1050 to 900 BCE, is known to historians as the deepest dark. It is the archaeological nadir of the Greek world. If you were to look at a map of archaeological sites from the 13th century BCE, the map would be crowded with dots, towns, villages, cemeteries and ports. But if you look at a map of the 10th century BCE, the dots vanish. The map goes blank. It is estimated that the population of Greece in this century may have been as little as 10% of what it was during the height of the Mycenaean age. Imagine a world where 9 out of every 10 people are gone, the landscape has emptied out, the forests have returned, reclaiming the terraced fields where olives once grew. The roads are overgrown, the silence is profound. Foreign powers too seem to forget that Greece exists. In the records of Egypt and the Near East, the Greeks simply disappear. There are no diplomatic letters, there is no trade. For the outside world, the Greek peninsula has become a ghost land, a jagged coastline of silence at the edge of the known world. For an archaeologist, this is the most frustrating and fascinating period. We call it archaeological invisibility. The people of this time built with mud brick that melted back into the earth. They used wood that rotted away. They were poor, so they left few treasures in their graves. They lived lightly on the land, leaving footprints so faint that 3,000 years of rain have almost washed them away. But even in the deepest dark, if you know where to look, there is a pulse. In this century of silence, a revolution was taking place in the fire of the forge. It was a revolution born of desperation. As we touched on earlier, the Bronze Age was an age of alloy. To make bronze, you needed copper and tin. But the tin trade had died with the palaces. The Greek smiths were left with heaps of useless copper and no way to harden it. They faced a choice: adapt or perish. And so, in the smoky small workshops of the Dark Age villages, they turned to the grey, ugly ore that they dug from their own hills: iron. The transition to the Iron Age was not glamorous. In the beginning, iron was the poor man's metal. It was difficult to smelt, requiring temperatures far higher than a simple wood fire could produce. It required bellows, charcoal, and endless hours of hammering to squeeze out the impurities. The early iron weapons we find in graves from this period are often crude. They are rusted lumps that look more like corroded driftwood than swords. But the smiths were learning. They were experimenting. They discovered that by quenching the hot iron in water, they could make it hard. They discovered that by reheating it, they could make it tough. Slowly, painfully, they mastered the black metal. By 950 BCE, the Greeks were no longer dependent on the outside world for their weapons. They had achieved technological independence. The sword of the Bronze Age hero was a symbol of international trade. The sword of the Dark Age warrior was a product of local self-reliance. The isolation was forcing them to become ingenious, and while the smiths hammered in the dark, the potters were quietly reinventing art. In the previous century, the pottery had been sloppy and chaotic, the sub-Mycenaean style of survival. But around 1050 BCE, in the clay workshops of Athens, something remarkable happens. The chaos disappears. A new style emerges, one that historians call proto-geometric. It is a dry name for a beautiful thing. Look at the vases from this period. They are cleaner. The shapes are tighter, thrown on a faster wheel. But the decoration is the key. The potters stopped trying to draw sloppy pictures of the natural world. Instead, they turned to mathematics. They began to cover the vases with precise concentric circles. They used broad bands of black glaze. They embraced symmetry and order. For the first time, we find evidence that potters were using a compass, a multiple brush attached to a pivot point, to draw perfect mathematical circles on the clay. This is not just a change in fashion, it is a change in mindset. In the midst of chaos and poverty, the Greek mind was seeking order. They were imposing geometry on the mud. It is the very first stirring of the rational mathematical spirit that would later build the Parthenon and calculate the circumference of the earth. This artistic reawakening brings us to the one light that never quite went out: Athens. While Mycenae and Pylos were burned to ash, Athens survived. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps its location was too remote for the main wave of raiders. Perhaps its Acropolis was too steep to storm. But archaeological evidence shows that Athens was continuously inhabited throughout the collapse. During the deepest dark, Athens became a magnet. It was a life raft. Refugees from the broken kingdoms flocked there, bringing their distinct traditions and dialects. Athens became a melting pot, a place where the memory of the past was preserved even as the future was being invented. It was here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, that the proto-geometric style was born. Athens was poor. We find very little gold in Athenian graves from this time, but it was stable, and in the Dark Ages, stability was the most precious commodity of all. But what of the society itself? How did these Iron Age survivors organize themselves? The pyramid of the Mycenaeans was gone. In its place, a new social web was spinning. The Basilius, the village chieftain, was evolving. By 950 BCE, we start to see the emergence of a warrior aristocracy. These were not god kings who ruled by divine right. They were first among equals. They were the men who owned the best iron armour, the largest herds of cattle, and the only horses. We see this shift in the way they buried their dead. In the Bronze Age, kings were buried in massive communal tombs. In the Dark Ages, the elite began to be buried individually, sometimes with their weapons, sometimes with their horses. It was a society obsessed with individual prowess and status. This is the world of the big man. To lead, you had to be strong. You had to be generous. You had to host feasts where you roasted whole oxen and gave gifts of iron tripods to your followers. If you appeared weak, you would be replaced. It was a competitive, violent, and intensely personal form of politics, and it laid the groundwork for the most uniquely Greek institution of all, the polis. The word polis is usually translated as city-state, but in the deepest dark it didn't mean a city of stone. It meant a community of citizens. It meant a group of people who decided to live together under a common set of customs, usually gathered around a defensible rock or a holy sanctuary. The polis was not built by architects. It was built by social contracts. It began here, in the poverty of the 10th century, as clustered villages started to coalesce into political units. And binding this fragile world together was the voice of the bard. We must imagine the evenings of this century. There are no books, there is no writing, there is only the firelight and the poet. The oral tradition was intensifying. The bards were not just entertainers, they were the libraries of the Dark Age. They carried the history, the theology, and the moral code of the people in their heads. But oral history is a living thing. It changes with every telling. As the bards sang of the great Bronze Age heroes, of Ajax and Hector, they inevitably polluted the history with their own reality. When Homer describes a hero's funeral, he describes cremation, burning the body on a pyre. This was the practice of the Dark Age, not the Bronze Age, who buried their dead. When he describes the layout of a chieftain's house, he describes the modest timber halls of the Iron Age, not the stone palaces of Mycenae. The legends were being Dark Age-ified. The heroes of the past were being dressed in the clothes of the present. The result was a hybrid mythology, a dreamscape where Bronze Age geography met Iron Age morality. This is why the Iliad and the Odyssey feel so resonant. They are not accurate history books of the Bronze Age. They are the distilled suffering and resilience of the Dark Age. They are the songs of a people who had lost everything and were trying to remember who they were. By the year 900 BCE, the pulse of the Greek world was becoming stronger. The population had stopped shrinking and was beginning to inch upward. The smiths had mastered iron. The potters were drawing perfect circles. Athens was growing. The deepest dark was not a coma. It was an incubation. In the silence, the slate had been wiped clean. The rigid, top-down structures of the past were gone, leaving room for something new to grow. A society was forming that was scrappier, more egalitarian, and more competitive than what had come before. The isolation was about to end. The Greeks, hardened by 2 centuries of survival, were beginning to look at the horizon again. They were beginning to remember the sea. The darkness is beginning to lift. And as the dawn approaches, the map is about to change once more. The wanderers are preparing to move. The silence of the deepest dark did not last forever. Human societies are like water. They cannot stay still for long. Eventually the pressure builds. Eventually the dam breaks. We have spent the last hour in a world that was contracted, where life was lived within the narrow horizon of the village. But as we approach the year 1000 BCE, that horizon begins to expand. The Greeks are beginning to move again. This movement was not a coordinated military campaign. It was not an imperial expansion ordered by a king. It was a migration. It was a disorganized, desperate, and hopeful scattering of people across the sea. It was a diaspora that would fundamentally redraw the map of the ancient world. Imagine standing on the eastern coast of mainland Greece, perhaps on the rocky shores of Attica or the long island of Euboea, looking out across the Aegean Sea. For generations, that sea had been a barrier, a blue wall of danger. But now, it became a road. We are witnessing the event known to history as the Ionian Migration. The traditional story, passed down in later Greek legends, tells us that these people were refugees. They were fleeing the turmoil of the mainland, driven out by invaders or hunger. They packed their families, their goats, and their few iron tools into small open boats and set sail toward the rising sun. The island hopped across the Cyclades, using the stepping stones of Andros, Tinos and Naxos, until they reached the western coast of what is now Turkey. This region would come to be known as Ionia. This was a pivotal moment. Before this migration, Greece was geographically limited to the European peninsula. After this migration, Greece was the Aegean Sea itself. The Greeks now lived on both sides of the water. The Aegean was no longer a border, it was a lake in the centre of their world. These wanderers founded cities that would become legendary: Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna. Picture the arrival of these first settlers on the Anatolian coast. They were landing in a world that was alien to them. They were rubbing shoulders with the ancient civilizations of the East, the remnants of the Hittites, the Lydians, the Carians. This contact was electric. In the isolation of the mainland villages, Greek culture had stagnated. But here, on the frontier of Asia, the Ionian Greeks were exposed to new ideas, new art forms and new ways of thinking. It is no coincidence that centuries later, the first sparks of Greek science and philosophy would ignite here, in Miletus, not in Athens. It was the friction of the frontier that created the heat. But why did they leave the mainland in the first place? What pushed them into the boats? This brings us to the most controversial and debated mystery of the Dark Ages, the Dorian invasion. For thousands of years, the Greeks told a story about why the Bronze Age ended. They didn't talk about earthquakes or systems collapse. They talked about the return of the Heracleidae, the descendants of the hero, Heracles. According to the myth, these descendants led a fierce, warlike people from the wild mountains of the north, the Dorians, down into the Peloponnese to reclaim their birthright. They were said to be tougher, harsher, and less civilized than the Mycenaeans they conquered. For a long time, modern historians accepted this narrative. They looked at the smoking ruins of Pylos and Mycenae and said, "Here is the smoking gun. The Dorians did this." They imagined a violent wave of northern invaders sweeping away the soft, decadent palace culture with iron swords. But archaeology has a way of complicating simple stories. When we dig into the soil of the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, we do not find clear evidence of a massive coordinated invasion. We do not find a sudden layer of Dorian artifacts replacing Mycenaean ones. The pottery styles change, yes, but they change gradually. The burial customs shift, but not overnight. So, the Dorian invasion has become the Dorian problem. Most modern scholars now view it not as a lightning-fast military conquest, but as a slow, messy migration, or perhaps even an internal uprising. Imagine it not as a D-Day invasion, but as a gradual infiltration. Over decades, as the palace systems collapsed and the population thinned, tribes from the pastoral north, the Dorians, moved into the vacuum. They drifted south, bringing their distinct dialect and their tribal customs, settling in the empty lands of the Peloponnese and Crete. Or perhaps, as some daring historians suggest, the Dorians were there all along. Perhaps they were the lower classes, the peasants living on the fringes of the Mycenaean world, who rose up when the palaces failed, asserting their own identity over the ruins of their masters. Whether they were invaders, migrants, or rebels, the arrival of the Dorians split the Greek world in two. This divide would define the rest of Greek history. The Greeks who fled to the east, to Ionia and Athens, spoke the Ionic dialect. They became associated with art, trade, philosophy, and democracy. They were the thinkers. The Greeks who settled in the south, in Sparta, Corinth, and Crete, spoke the Doric dialect. They became associated with militarism, conservatism, and rigid social order. They were the fighters. You can see this split even in the architecture that would rise centuries later. The Ionic column is slender, elegant, with scroll-like volutes at the top, feminine and graceful. The Doric column is thick, plain, and unadorned, masculine and strong. This architectural difference is a fossilized memory of this Dark Age migration. It is the stone echo of a cultural divorce that happened 3,000 years ago. But the movement wasn't just east and south. To the north, another group, the Aeolians, migrated from Thessaly to the northern coast of Asia Minor and the island of Lesbos. The map was swirling. The static, frozen world of the deepest dark had thawed. The Greeks were becoming a diaspora people, a web of tribes connected by the sea. Consider the courage required for these journeys. These were not explorers equipped with maps and compasses. These were families piling into open-deck galleys, powered by oars and simple square sails. They were sailing into the unknown, guided only by the stars and the flight of birds. They carried with them the sacred fire from their home village's hearth, the Pristanion. When they landed on a new shore, their first act was to dig a pit, place the embers of the old fire into the new earth, and blow them into flame. It was a ritual of continuity. "We are not lost," the fire said. "We are simply transplanting the roots." This era of migration helps explain the patchwork nature of the classical Greek world. Greece never became a single unified nation-state like Egypt or Persia. It remained a collection of independent, often quarrelling city-states. Why? Because they began as isolated colonies, founded by different tribes, in different places at different times. They were united by language and religion, but divided by geography and history. The fragmentation of the Dark Ages created the fierce independence of the Classical Age. As the 10th century turned into the 9th, the dust of these migrations began to settle, the map stabilised. The Ionians were firmly established in the east, the Dorians held the Peloponnese, the Aeolians held the north. The Greek world was now vast. It stretched from the coast of Italy in the west to the coast of Turkey in the east. It was a maritime civilization, hugging the shores of the Mediterranean, turning its back on the deep interior of the continent. Plato would later describe the Greeks as living like frogs around a pond. That pond was the Aegean, and it was during these wandering centuries that they took their places on the lily pads. But something else was happening in these new settlements, something invisible but potent. When you take a people out of their ancestral home, when you strip them of their old hierarchies, their old kings and their old traditions, and you drop them into a new land where they must build from scratch, you create a space for innovation. In the new cities of Ionia, the old rules didn't apply. A man could reinvent himself. A Basilius was just the man who could lead the ship, not necessarily the man with the most ancestors. The rigid social structures of the mainland loosened in the salt air of the Aegean. This is often the gift of a dark age. It acts as a solvent. It dissolves the calcified structures of the past. The Mycenaean world was magnificent, but it was rigid. It was a pyramid that could not change. The Dark Age migration was a fluid, chaotic scattering that allowed for new shapes to form. We can see this new fluidity in the archaeology of the 9th century. In the cemeteries of Athens and Lefkandi, we start to see richer graves again. We see jewellery made of gold. We see luxury goods from the Near East appearing in Ionian tombs. The trade routes were slowly reknitting. The refugees had become settlers. The settlers were becoming traders. The isolation was breaking. A potter in Athens might see a design from a textile brought from Syria and copy it onto a clay vase. A smith in Cyprus might learn a new technique for hardening iron from a visitor from Crete. The synapses of the Mediterranean brain were beginning to fire again. As we end this chapter, imagine the Greek world as a garden that has been burned to the ground. For a long time there was only ash. Then there were weeds, the hardy, scrubby survival of the deepest dark. But now the wind has blown new seeds across the water. They have landed in fresh soil in Ionia, in Lesbos, in Rhodes. They are taking root. They are different plants than what grew before. They are wilder, hardier, and more diverse. The transplanting is complete. The Greeks have survived the collapse. They have survived the hunger, and they have survived the journey. They have claimed the Aegean. Now they are ready to bloom. The dawn is no longer a hope. It is a visible line of grey on the eastern horizon. The geometric age is coming. The alphabet is coming. The city-state is coming. The wandering is over. The rebuilding begins. The year is 900 BCE. If you have been with us through the last hour, you have walked through the ashes of palaces, hidden in the mud huts of refugees, and sailed across the dark Aegean with desperate migrants. We have witnessed a civilization in a coma, but now the patient is waking up. The dawn of the 9th century BCE does not break with a trumpet blast. It breaks with the scratching of a potter's brush and the splash of oars rowing eastward. It is a quiet renaissance, but it is unmistakable. The era of survival is ending, the era of ambition is beginning. Historians call this period the geometric age. It is named after the pottery, which sounds dry, but in a world without writing, art is our only window into the human mind. And the mind of the 9th century Greek was changing. Look at this vase. This is the work of a master. It stands nearly 5 feet tall, a monumental grave marker from the Dipylon Cemetery in Athens. Gone are the sloppy, wavy lines of the Dark Age. In their place is an explosion of precision. Every inch of the surface is covered. There are meanders, the famous Greek key pattern that winds back on itself like a labyrinth. There are zigzags, triangles, and diamonds, all executed with a mathematical exactitude that suggests a society obsessed with order. Art historians call this horror vacui, the fear of empty space. The artist refuses to leave a single patch of clay undefined. It is as if, after centuries of chaos and uncertainty, the Greeks were desperate to impose structure on their world. They were knitting the universe back together, line by line. But look closer, between the geometric bands. For the first time in centuries, something new appears. Figures. Stick-figure men with triangular torsos. Horses with spindly legs. They are stylized, almost abstract, but they are unmistakably telling a story. We see a funeral procession. We see a body laid out on a bier surrounded by mourners tearing their hair. We see chariots and warriors. The human narrative has returned to art. The Greeks are no longer just making bowls to hold gruel. They are making monuments to remember their dead. They are reclaiming their own history. This return of confidence was fueled by a return of wealth. And wealth, in the ancient world, meant one thing: trade. For 200 years, the Aegean had been a barrier. Now, the bravest sailors were turning it back into a highway. The leaders of this new age of exploration were the Euboeans, the people of the long island that hugs the coast of Attica. While the Spartans were drilling in the south and the Athenians were painting their pots, the Euboeans were building ships. Around 825 BCE, these merchant adventurers did something audacious. They sailed east, past Cyprus, all the way to the coast of modern-day Syria. There, at the mouth of the Orontes River, they established a trading post known today as Almina. Almina was the airlock. It was the place where the raw, re-emerging world of Greece touched, the ancient, sophisticated world of the Near East. Imagine a Euboean sailor stepping off his boat in Almina. He's coming from a village of mud brick huts and iron chieftains. He steps onto a dock where he hears Aramaic and Phoenician spoken. He sees scribes writing on papyrus. He smells frankincense. He sees luxury goods that his grandfather had only heard of in legends. He trades his iron, his slaves, and his pottery. In exchange, he loads his ship with gold, with ivory, with dyes. This contact changed everything. The Euboeans brought back more than just trinkets. They brought back the taste for civilization. They brought back the memory of what it meant to be sophisticated. Archaeologists have found the proof of this reconnection in a remarkable grave at Lefkandi, on Euboea. It dates to roughly 950 BCE, slightly earlier than the main explosion of trade, hinting at the very first stirrings of this revival. Inside the grave was the skeleton of a warrior, cremated and placed in a bronze urn from Cyprus. Next to him was a woman, buried with gold jewellery that included a pendant from Babylon, already 1,000 years old when it was buried. But the most shocking find was the building itself. This was no simple hut. It was a massive apsidal building, 150 feet long, surrounded by a wooden colonnade. It is the Heroon of Lefkandi. It suggests that even in the so-called Dark Age, there were big men who could command the labour to build a princely hall. This brings us to the new social reality of the 9th century. The tribal chieftain was evolving into something sharper, something more exclusive, the aristocrat. The word aristocratia means rule of the best, and in the geometric age, being the best meant owning land, owning a ship, and above all, owning a horse. The horse was the Ferrari of the Iron Age. It was useless for ploughing the rocky Greek soil. It was only marginally useful in the rough terrain of warfare. The stirrup hadn't been invented yet, so cavalry was precarious. Its primary purpose was status. To own a horse was to say, I have enough land to feed an animal that does no work. These new aristocrats, the hippes, or horsemen, began to separate themselves from the common farmers. They didn't just rule, they performed. They developed a culture of competitive display. They held feasts, proto-symposia, where they drank wine mixed with water, boasted of their lineage, and competed in athletic games. They were obsessed with kleos, glory. If the Bronze Age was a bureaucracy, the geometric age was a contest. And to structure this contest, the Greeks began to create sacred spaces that belonged to no single city, but to everyone. Around the year 800 BCE, at a remote sanctuary in the western Peloponnese, something significant began. It was a lush valley where the Alpheos and Cladeos rivers met, dedicated to Zeus, the father of gods. It was called Olympia. Tradition tells us that the first Olympic Games were held here in 776 BCE. Whether that date is exact or legendary doesn't matter. What matters is the idea. Every 4 years, the constant petty warfare between the villages would stop. A sacred truce was declared. Men from Sparta, from Athens, from Euboea, from Ionia would travel to this muddy field to strip naked and run. This was the birth of Panhellenism, the idea of all Greeks. Politically, they were divided. They would kill each other over a strip of borderland or a herd of goats. But culturally, they were becoming one people. They realized that despite their different dialects and laws, they worshipped the same Zeus. They valued the same arete, excellence. They were distinct from the non-Greeks, the barbaroi, whose speech sounded like bar to their ears. At Olympia, and soon at the Oracle of Delphi, the scattered tribes of the Dark Age were forging a national identity. They were realizing that they were a family, a dysfunctional, violent family perhaps, but a family nonetheless, and every family needs a story. This brings us to the final, and perhaps greatest development of the first light. Somewhere on the coast of Ionia, perhaps in the city of Smyrna or Chios, a voice was emerging that would define the Greek world forever. We do not know if he was a single man. We do not know if he was blind, as legend says. We do not even know exactly when he lived. But we know the name Homer. For centuries the bards had been singing songs of the Trojan War. They had passed the verses down like heirlooms, polishing them, expanding them, changing them. It was a fluid tradition. But in the 8th century BCE, this river of song began to crystallize. A monumental genius, or perhaps a school of geniuses, took this scattered oral history and wove it into 2 massive epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These poems are the mirror of the geometric age. When Homer describes the shield of Achilles, with its intricate concentric circles of cities, stars, and oceans, he is describing the mind of the geometric artist. He is describing the same impulse for order and completeness that we saw on the Dipolon vases. When he describes the funeral games of Patroclus, the chariot races, the wrestling, the foot races, he's describing the aristocratic culture of the 8th century, the world of the Olympic athletes. When he describes the assembly of the army where kings argue and debate, he's describing the proto-politics of the emerging city-state, not the absolute monarchy of the Bronze Age. Homer was looking backward, pretending to write about the Bronze Age, but he was holding a mirror to his own time. He gave the aristocracy their code of conduct. He taught them that life is short, that death is certain, and that the only thing that endures is glory. Always be the best and superior to others. This line from the Iliad became the motto of the Greek spirit. It was the engine that would drive the incredible achievements of the classical age. but it was also the curse that would ensure they could never stop fighting each other. By the end of the 9th century, the silence is broken. The silence of the ruins has been replaced by the roar of the crowd at Olympia, the haggling of merchants at Almina, and the chanting of the bard in the Megaron. The machinery of civilization has been restarted. The population is exploding. The villages are growing together, knitting themselves into the first true poleis, cities like Sparta, Corinth, and Argos. But there is one tool still missing. The Greeks have the wealth, they have the art, they have the stories, but they cannot write them down. The bards are still holding the Iliad in their memories. The merchants are still conducting trade with handshakes and tallies. The laws are still unspoken customs. That is about to change. Just over the horizon, a ship is sailing from Phoenicia. It carries a cargo more valuable than gold or ivory. It carries a set of strange symbols, alephs, bets, gimels. The Greeks are about to steal the alphabet, and once they do, the Dark Ages will not just end, they will be shattered by the written word. The sun has risen. The day has begun. The year is roughly 800 BCE. We are standing on a dock again. Perhaps it is in the bustling port of Almina on the Syrian coast, or perhaps on the rocky shoreline of Sbaia, where the merchant ships are pulled up onto the sand like resting sea monsters. The air smells of tar, drying fish, and the sharp tang of unmixed wine. The noise is a babble of languages, the guttural, rapid-fire speech of Phoenician traders mixing with the rhythmic, melodic cadence of the Greeks. A ship has just docked. It is a broad-beamed Phoenician gorlos, a bathtub ship heavy in the water. The sailors are unloading the usual treasures: cedar logs from Lebanon, silver from the mines of Spain, purple cloth dyed from the murex snail. But tucked away in the mind of a Greek merchant standing on that dock, or perhaps scribbled on a scrap of perishable papyrus in the captain's manifest, is a cargo far more dangerous and enduring than gold. It is a technology, a set of 22 strange jagged symbols, aleph, bet, gimel, dalet. The Greeks are about to steal the alphabet. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must remember the silence that preceded it. For 400 years since the burning of the palaces, the Greek world had been illiterate. The complex syllabary of Linear B had vanished into the smoke of Pylos. For 4 centuries, every law, every contract, every prayer and every poem had to be locked inside a human skull. If a king made a decree, it existed only as long as the herald's voice echoed in the square. If a bard died before teaching his song to an apprentice, the song died with him. Memory was the only library. But the world was becoming too complex for memory. The Euboean traders, conducting business from Italy to Syria, needed a way to track their profits. The rising aristocrats, obsessed with their lineage, wanted a way to make their names eternal. The tool they found belonged to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the masters of the Iron Age Mediterranean. They were a Semitic people from the coast of modern-day Lebanon, brilliant sailors and ruthless businessmen. Their writing system was a marvel of efficiency. Unlike the thousands of hieroglyphs of Egypt, or the hundreds of syllabic signs of Linear B, the Phoenician script had only 22 characters. It was an abjad, a consonant-only alphabet. It was a tool of commerce. It was designed for speed. A Phoenician scribe could look at a sack of grain and quickly scratch WHT, wheat. The reader would supply the vowels from context. Sometime in the early 8th century, a Greek, we do not know his name, though legends call him Cadmus, sat down with a Phoenician, perhaps over a cup of wine in a trading post. He looked at these symbols and saw a possibility. But there was a problem. The Greek language is not like Phoenician. Phoenician is a Semitic language built on roots of 3 consonants. You can guess the vowels and usually be right, but Greek is an Indo-European language. Vowels are the flesh and blood of the words. In Greek, changing a vowel changes the meaning entirely. Pater means father. Pota means drinking cup. If you only write PTR, no one knows if you are talking about your dad or your mug. So, This anonymous Greek genius did something revolutionary. He hacked the code. He took the Phoenician letters that represented sounds the Greeks didn't use, guttural stops and strange breaths, and he repurposed them. He took aleph, a glottal stop, and turned it into alpha, the sound A. He took he, a breathy sound, and turned it into epsilon, the sound E. He took ayin and turned it into omicron, the sound O. It seems like a small technical adjustment, but it was a cognitive explosion. By creating the first true alphabet, a system with symbols for both consonants and vowels, the Greeks created a machine that could record the human voice with perfect fidelity. Linear B could only record lists. The Phoenician abjad could record business transactions, but the Greek alphabet could record the nuance of a whisper. It could capture the rhythm of a hexameter verse. It could preserve the exact sound of a man crying out in rage or a woman singing a lullaby. It was the first technology capable of freezing speech in time, and what is truly fascinating is what the Greeks chose to write first. When a civilization invents writing, the first texts are usually practical. Tax receipts, king lists, dedications to gods, laws. But the earliest examples of the Greek alphabet are not bureaucratic. They are not lists of sheep. They are not royal proclamations. They are poetry, and they are jokes. Let us travel to the Kerameikos cemetery in Athens to the year 740 BCE. Archaeologists found a simple wine jug here, a geometric picture known as the dipylon oinocho. Scratched into the neck of the jug, in a shaky early hand that reads from right to left, mirroring the Phoenician style, is a line of text. It says, "Whoever of all these dancers now plays most delicately." The inscription trails off, but the implication is clear. This jug was a trophy. It was a prize awarded at a dance contest, perhaps a wild, wine-soaked party among the new aristocracy. The inscription is written in perfect dactylic hexameter, the rhythm of epic poetry. Think about the intimacy of that. The first voice to speak to us from the darkness is not a king commanding obedience. It is a partygoer praising a dancer. It is a celebration of human grace. But there is an even more remarkable artifact found far to the west on the island of Ischia in the Bay of Naples. This was the site of Pithecusae, one of the earliest Euboean colonies. Here, in a humble grave of a young boy, archaeologists found a simple clay drinking cup. It was made in Rhodes, but deposited in Italy around 720 BCE. Scratched onto the side, again in verse, is a 3-line poem that serves as a playful challenge to the heroic past. It is known as Nestor's Cup. The inscription reads, "I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, desire for beautifully crowned Aphrodite will seize him instantly." This is a joke, a literary Iron Age meme. In the legends of the Trojan War, King Nestor possessed a legendary cup made of gold, so heavy that only a strong man could lift it. The owner of this cheap clay cup is making a witty comparison. Nestor had a golden cup, he is saying, but I have this cup, and while his cup was heavy, mine is magic. It makes you fall in love. This tiny shard of clay tells us 3 massive things about the 8th century BCE. First, it tells us that the stories of the Trojan War were already so famous, so universally known, that you could make a joke about them in a colony hundreds of miles from Greece and expect people to get it. The Iliad was already the cultural glue of the Hellenic world. Second, it tells us that literacy was not just for the high priests. This was a personal possession, buried with a boy. The alphabet was spreading. It was becoming a tool for the individual. And third, it tells us that the Greeks used this new technology to impose their personality on the inanimate world. "I am the cup of Nestor," the inscription says. The object speaks. The writing gives the clay a voice. This was the democratization of memory. In the Mycenaean Bronze Age, if you were not a king or a scribe, you left no trace. You lived, you worked, and you died in silence. But the new alphabet changed the rules of immortality. Now, a potter could sign his name on a vase, Exekius made me. A mercenary could scratch his name on the leg of a statue in Egypt. Archon was here. A lover could write a curse on a lead tablet and bury it, asking the gods to bind the heart of the woman who rejected him. The silence of the Dark Ages was shattered by a cacophony of voices. Everyone wanted to speak. Everyone wanted to be remembered. But the greatest impact of the alphabet was on the oral tradition itself. For centuries, the bards had held the vast, sprawling architecture of the epic cycles in their minds. It was a feat of memory that seems impossible to us today. They used formulaic phrases, rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles, as mental building blocks to construct the poem anew with each performance. But memory is fluid. It changes with the times. If the alphabet had not arrived when it did, the Iliad and the Odyssey might have continued to drift, changing shape until they were unrecognizable. Sometime around 750 or 700 BCE, the new technology met the old tradition. Someone, perhaps Homer himself, or a scribe listening to him, did the unthinkable. They took the living song and pinned it down like a butterfly in a display case. They wrote it down. It must have been a monumental task. The Iliad is over 15,000 lines long. It would have required stacks of papyrus or piles of expensive parchment. It would have taken weeks of dictation. But the result was the preservation of the soul of Greece. By fixing the text, the alphabet created a standard. It created a Bible for the Greek culture. A Spartan and an Athenian might hate each other, but they could both read the same lines about Hector's courage and recognize the same values. This was the moment the Dark Ages truly ended. Not because the buildings got taller or the armies got bigger, but because the history began to be recorded. The mist of legend evaporated, and the hard light of history flooded in. Once you have writing, you can have written law. In the Dark Ages, law was custom. It was whatever the Basileus said it was. It was arbitrary. But in the coming century, the Greeks would begin to carve their laws into stone pillars and set them up in the marketplace for all to read. If a man steals a goat, he pays 3 times its value. When the law is written, it stands above the king. It stands above the judge. It becomes objective. This idea, the rule of law, is the child of the alphabet. Once you have writing, you can have philosophy. You can write down an argument, hand it to someone else, and let them tear it apart. You can build a tower of ideas, one generation adding to the next, without having to memorize the whole foundation every time. The alphabet was the catalyst. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg of the archaic age. As we leave the 8th century, the Greek world is buzzing. The bards are still singing, but the scribes are scratching. The silence is gone. The Greeks have found their voice, and they are about to use it to ask questions that will shake the foundations of the world. Questions about the nature of the gods. Questions about the rights of men. Questions about the shape of the universe. The long winter of illiteracy is over. The spring of the mind has arrived. But the Greeks were not content just to sit at home and write poetry. They were a people of the sea, and the sea was calling them. The population was growing. The land was filling up. The younger sons of the new aristocracy were hungry for land and glory. The horizon was expanding again. The alphabet travelled west to Italy, where it would be taught to the Etruscans and then to the Romans, eventually becoming the letters you're reading right now. The isolation was broken. The expansion was about to begin. The Greeks were about to colonize the world. The year is 750 BCE. We have watched the Greek world contract. We have watched it huddle in the hills, shivering in the cold of the deepest dark. We have watched it slowly, painfully, knit itself back together. But now the pressure is reversing. The vessel is full, and it is about to overflow. The success of the 8th century created a new problem, one that is the opposite of the famine and depopulation of the Dark Age. The problem was success itself. The population was booming. The villages had grown into towns, and the towns were growing into cities. But the land of Greece had not grown. It is a landscape of rock and spine, of thin soil and steep slopes. There is only so much wheat that can be grown in the valleys of Attica. There are only so many goats that can graze on the hills of Corinth. As the families of the aristocracy expanded and the families of the farmers multiplied, a hunger for land, stenochoria, began to gnaw at the heart of the new prosperity. The Greeks looked around them and saw a crowded room. They looked at the sea and saw a door. And so began the great colonization. This was not an empire building itself through conquest, like the Assyrians or later the Romans. The Greek expansion was a biological imperative. It was a swarm of bees leaving the hive to build a new comb. Between 750 and 550 BCE, hundreds of new Greek cities would sprout up along the coastlines of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. From the shores of Spain in the west to the coast of Ukraine in the east, the Greeks were on the move. But unlike the chaotic migrations of the Dark Age, the desperate flight of refugees, this new movement was calculated, organised, and deeply religious. It began not at the port, but at the mountain. By the mid-8th century, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, perched high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, had become the spiritual centre of the Greek world. It was the navel of the earth. Before a city sent out a colony, they would send envoys to Delphi. They would walk the sacred way, climb the steep path past the treasuries, and ask the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, for guidance. "Where shall we go?" they would ask. "To the white lands of the west, to the rich soil of the south." The oracle's answers were often cryptic, wrapped in poetry and riddle, but they gave the venture a divine mandate. To found a colony was a holy act. It was risky. It meant sailing into waters patrolled by Phoenician rivals, or landing on shores inhabited by hostile tribes. The blessing of Apollo was the only insurance policy they had. Once the oracle spoke, the mother city, the metropolis, would choose a leader. He was called the oikist. The oikist was usually a nobleman, often a younger son who had no inheritance at home. He was the captain, the general, and the priest of the expedition. It was his job to gather the settlers, usually young men, hungry for land and adventure, and lead them into the unknown. Imagine the moment of departure. It is a ritual of severing and remembering. The settlers gather at the Prytaneum, the town hall of the mother city. In the centre burns the sacred fire of the goddess Hestia, a fire that has never been allowed to go out. The oikist takes a torch and lights a lamp from this fire. He carries it onto his ship, shielding it from the wind. This fire is the genetic code of the city. If they survive the voyage, if they defeat the locals, if they build a wall and a temple, this fire will be used to light the hearth of the new city. The daughter city will be independent. It will have its own laws and its own government, but it will share the same flame as its mother. The ships they sailed in were not the heavy merchant vessels of the Phoenicians. They were pentacontas, 50-oared galleys, long and sleek, designed for speed and raiding. They turned their prows west. The primary target of this expansion was Italy and Sicily. The land there was lush, volcanic, and incredibly fertile. A paradise compared to the rocky soil of Greece. So many Greeks settled in southern Italy that the Romans would later call the region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. They founded cities that still stand today: Syracuse, Taranto, Naples, Neapolis, literally new city. Imagine the encounter on those shores. The Greek settlers, clad in bronze armour, stepping off their ships to face the indigenous peoples, the Sicels, the Messapians, the Etruscans. Sometimes there was trade. The Etruscans in particular were hungry for Greek pottery and wine. They became the Greeks' best customers, absorbing Greek art and myths so thoroughly that their own culture became a mirror of the Hellenic world. Sometimes there was war. The colonies were often built on blood. The native populations were driven inland, enslaved, or forced to pay tribute. The Greeks were bringing civilization, yes, but they were also bringing the sword. But the expansion did not stop in the west. It pushed north into the cold, foggy waters of the Black Sea. The Greeks called it the Pontus Euxinus. the hospitable sea. It was a euphemism, a superstitious attempt to flatter a body of water that was notoriously prone to violent storms. Here they founded cities like Sinope and Trapezus. They came for the grain, the rich, black earth of the Scythian plains, modern Ukraine, could grow wheat in quantities that the Greek mind could barely comprehend. They came for the gold of the Caucasus. They came for the fish, the tunny that migrated through the Bosphorus in millions, and they pushed south to the ancient coast of Africa. There is a wonderful story about the founding of Cyrene in Libya, preserved by the historian Herodotus. It tells of a man named Battus, who had a terrible stutter. He went to Delphi to ask for a cure for his voice. The oracle ignored his stutter and told him, "Battus, you came for a voice, but Lord Apollo sends you to Libya to nurture flocks." Battus didn't want to go to Libya. No Greek lived there. It was a desert. He went back home and ignored the god. But then, drought struck his island of Thera. The crops failed. Desperate, he returned to Delphi. The oracle was annoyed. "If you know Libya better than I, who have been there, then I admire your wisdom." So Battus took 2 ships and sailed south. They landed on the coast of North Africa, guided by local Libyans to a high plateau where the rain fell. There they founded Cyrene. It became one of the richest cities in the Greek world, famous for a plant called silphium, a medicinal herb that grew only there and was worth its weight in silver. And, legend says, when Battus saw a lion in the desert and shouted in fear, his stutter was cured. The shock of the new world had fixed him. This story, whether true or legendary, captures the spirit of the age. It was an era of reluctant adventurers, pushed by necessity and pulled by destiny, finding wealth in places they had never imagined. The result of this explosion was a transformation of the Greek identity. Before the colonization movement, a Greek was just a man who lived in a village in Attica or Laconia. He defined himself by his tribe. But now, Greeks were living on the edge of the world. They were living next to Scythians who drank milk and wore trousers. They were living next to Egyptians who worshipped animal-headed gods. They were living next to Celts in Gaul, where the Greeks founded Massalia, modern Marseille. This contact created a sharp definition of us versus them. The Greeks looked at these foreign peoples and noticed one thing. They did not speak Greek. Their languages sounded like nonsense stammering. Ba ba ba! And so, the word barbarian was born. It was not originally a racial slur, it was a linguistic one. A barbarian was simply someone who didn't speak Greek. But as the colonies grew rich and proud, it began to take on a cultural weight. To be a Hellene, a Greek, meant to live in a polis, to worship the Olympian gods, to compete in the games, and to speak the language of Homer. To be anything else was to be a barbarian. Ironically, it was by scattering across the world that the Greeks discovered who they really were. The pond of the Mediterranean was now ringed with Greek frogs. From the Crimea to Catalonia, a traveller could step off a boat and find a gymnasium, a temple to Zeus, and a market selling olive oil. And with this network came a revolution in the economy. In the Dark Ages, wealth was land and cows. Trade was barter. I give you an ox, you give me a tripod. It was clumsy. But in the 7th century, likely inspired by the kingdom of Lydia in Asia Minor, the Greeks adopted a new technology that would lubricate the wheels of this vast new market: coinage. The first coins were lumps of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, stamped with the seal of a king or a city, a lion, a turtle, an owl. This was a psychological shift as profound as the alphabet. Value was no longer subjective, it was standardized. A merchant from Corinth could sail to Sicily with a bag of silver colts, Corinthian coins stamped with Pegasus, and buy grain without having to herd oxen onto his ship. Wealth became portable. A new class of men emerged, the nouveau riche, merchants, ship owners and workshop masters who had no aristocratic ancestors but had pockets full of silver. These men began to look at the old aristocrats, the horsemen, who ruled the cities by right of birth, and ask a dangerous question. Why do they rule, and not us? The expansion had solved the problem of land hunger, but it had created a new problem: social turbulence. The old tribal systems of the Dark Age could not contain the energy of this new, wealthy, expansive world. The colonies were often laboratories for democracy. In a new city, where everyone had arrived on the same boat, it was harder to maintain the old rigid hierarchies. They wrote new laws. They designed new street grids. They experimented with equality. The wind from the colonies blew back to the mother cities, carrying the scent of change. As the 8th century turns into the 7th, the Greek world is unrecognizable from the silent ruins we walk through in the beginning. It is loud, rich, and aggressive. The darkness is a distant memory. But the greatest invention of the Greeks, the thing that would make them immortal, was not the coin, or the colony, or the ship. It was the soldier. In the final chapter of our transition, we'll see how this new wealth and this new iron technology merged to create a new way of fighting. A way of fighting that would empower the common man and eventually topple the aristocrats. The age of the hero is over. The age of the phalanx is about to begin. The year is 700 BCE. We have walked a long road together. We have seen the palaces burn, the writing vanish, and the population scatter into the hills. We have watched the slow, painful recovery of the geometric potters and the desperate bravery of the colonists. But now, the recovery is over. The patient has not only healed, he has grown into something stronger, stranger, and more brilliant than before. The Dark Ages are officially dead. We have entered the Archaic Age. The difference is visible on the skyline. For centuries, the gods of Greece had been worshipped in modest structures, huts of timber and mud brick, perhaps with a thatched roof, vulnerable to fire and rot. They were temporary houses for eternal beings. But in the 7th century, the Greeks began to build for eternity. They discovered, or rediscovered, the power of stone. Travel with me to the sanctuary of Olympia, where the wooden pillars of the old temple of Hera are slowly, over generations, being replaced by limestone. This is the birth of monumental architecture. The Greeks looked at the wooden beams of their ancestors and translated them into stone. The tree trunk became the column. The beam became the architrave. The ends of the wooden rafters became the triglyphs, the three-grooved blocks that define the Doric order. It is a petrified forest. The memory of the Dark Age timber hall is preserved forever in the marble of the temple. Two distinct styles emerged, fossilizing the cultural divide we spoke of earlier. In the mainland and the west, the Doric order rose, stout, plain, and powerful, like a Spartan warrior. In the east, in the Ionian cities of Asia Minor, the Ionic order flourished. Slender, ornate, and capped with scroll-like volutes, like a ram's horn or a woman's curled hair. These temples were not just houses of worship. They were banks. They were statements of supreme confidence. A city does not drag tons of marble from a quarry and stack it 40 feet in the air unless it believes it will survive to see the roof finished. The age of survival was replaced by the age of ambition, and as the temples rose, the gods within them took on a new face. In the Dark Ages, sculpture was small, tiny bronze figurines of horses or warriors. But now, inspired by the colossal statues they had seen in Egypt, Greek sculptors began to carve life-size figures out of marble. We call them kouros for the young men, and kora for the young women. Look at a kouros from 600 BCE. He stands stiffly, his left foot forward, his arms at his sides, fists clenched. It is clearly an imitation of an Egyptian pharaoh. But there is a crucial difference. The Egyptian statue is attached to a back pillar. It is part of the stone. The Greek kouros stands free. He is liberated from the block. He is stepping out into the world. And look at his face. He is wearing a strange, serene expression that art historians call the archaic smile. It is not a smile of amusement. It is a smile of vitality. The sculptor is trying to capture the spark of life, the breath pneuma inside the stone. After centuries of silence and abstraction, the human being has returned to the centre of the stage. This new focus on the human individual is mirrored in the pottery. The geometric patterns, the obsession with order, begin to recede. The black figure technique, perfected in Corinth and Athens, turns the vase into a canvas. We see Achilles playing dice with Ajax. We see Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion. And for the first time we see the artist's ego. On a vase from this period, we find the signature, "Sophilos painted me." The anonymity of the Dark Age is gone. Individuals are stepping out of the collective shadow. But the most profound transformation of the Archaic Age was not in art, but in war, and this change would plant the seeds of democracy. In the Iliad, war is a series of duels. The great heroes, Achilles, Hector, fight in single combat while the masses watch and cheer. It is an aristocratic form of warfare. The outcome depends on the prowess of the few big men. But in the 7th century, a new technology of violence emerged. It was the phalanx. The new wealth of the Archaic Age meant that more men could afford armour. A farmer with a good harvest could buy a bronze helmet, greaves, and the most important piece of all, the hoplon. The hoplon was a massive round shield, about 3 feet in diameter, faced with bronze. It was heavy, and it had a unique double-handle system that allowed it to be held on the left arm. This shield was designed for cooperation. It covered the left half of your body and the right half of the man standing next to you. If you fought alone, the hoplon was clumsy. But if you stood shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours, overlapping your shields, you became a human tank. You became a wall of bronze and spear points. This was the birth of the hoplite. The phalanx changed everything. It didn't matter if you were the strongest man or the fastest runner. What mattered was that you held the line. What mattered was discipline, equality, and trust. The aristocrat in his chariot was useless against a solid wall of farmers who refused to budge. This military revolution triggered a political one. If the safety of the city depends on the farmer in the phalanx, then the farmer deserves a say in how the city is run. If I fight, I vote. This was the unwritten contract of the Archaic Age. The monopoly of the horseman was broken by the shield wall. The polis became a community of citizen soldiers, but the transition was turbulent. The friction between the old aristocrats and the newly empowered hoplites sparked a wave of revolutions. In city after city, ambitious men seized power, claiming to speak for the people against the corrupt elite. The Greeks called them tyrannos, tyrants. Today the word tyrant means a cruel oppressor. But in archaic Greece, it simply meant an unconstitutional ruler, a boss. Many tyrants were popular. They built aqueducts, redistributed land, and patronised the arts. They were the wrecking balls that smashed the old aristocracy, clearing the ground for the democracies that would follow. Other cities took a different path. They turned to lawgivers. In Athens, a man named Draco wrote the first written code of laws around 620 BCE. The laws were incredibly harsh. The penalty for stealing a cabbage was death, giving us the word draconian. But the severity mattered less than the medium. The laws were written down. They were carved into axons, wooden beams that rotated on pillars in the marketplace. For the first time, justice was not a secret known only to the priests. It was public knowledge. A poor man could point to the wood and say, "That is the law." It was the beginning of the rule of law. While the politicians were rewriting society, a group of men in the Ionian city of Miletus were rewriting the universe. We call them the pre-Socratic philosophers, but they were really the first scientists. Before this moment, if you asked, "Why does the river flood?" or "Why does the earth shake?" the answer was always the same: because Zeus wills it, or Poseidon is angry. But around 600 BCE, a man named Thales of Miletus asked a different question. He asked, "What is the world made of?" He didn't look to the myths. He looked at nature. He saw that water could be ice, liquid, or steam. He saw that life needs moisture. And he made a breathtaking leap. Everything is water. He was wrong, of course, but he was magnificently wrong. He was trying to explain the world using natural laws, not supernatural whims. He predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BCE, not through an oracle, but through mathematics. This was the Ionian Enlightenment. It was the moment the human mind decided it could understand the machinery of the cosmos. Anaximander suggested humans evolved from fish. Xenophanes mocked the idea that gods looked like humans, saying that if horses had hands, they would draw gods that looked like horses. The intellectual darkness was lifting. The Greeks were beginning to think, and they were beginning to feel. The epic poetry of Homer was grand, impersonal, and collective. It was about the we, the army, the people, the heroes. But in the Archaic Age, a new voice emerged. Lyric poetry. It was poetry sung to the lyre, and it was intensely personal. It was about the I. On the island of Lesbos, a woman named Sappho wrote verses of such burning intensity that Plato called her the 10th Muse. She didn't write about the wrath of Achilles. She wrote about the sight of a lover across a crowded room, about the sweat that pours down the skin, about the thudding of the heart. Eros shakes my soul, she wrote, like a wind on the mountain falling on the oaks. This is the discovery of the inner life. In the Dark Ages, people were defined by their clan, their tribe, their father. Now they were defined by their own emotions. As the Archaic Age matures, the map of Greece solidifies into the shapes we recognize. Two powers begin to rise above the rest, representing the two divergent souls of the Hellenic world. In the south, Sparta solves its hunger for land not by colonization, but by conquest. They enslave their neighbours, the Mycenaeans, turning them into helots. To keep this population of slaves in check, the Spartans transform their entire society into a military camp. They become the masters of the land war, a state of iron discipline where the individual is nothing and the state is everything. In the East, Athens takes a different path. It becomes a mistress of the sea. It embraces trade, welcomes foreigners, and moves haltingly, convulsively, toward a radical experiment in government called democracia. The stage is set. The actors have taken their marks. The silence of the Dark Ages is a distant memory, a story told to frighten children. The Greek world is loud, vibrant, argumentative, and brilliant. The temples are painted in garish reds and blues. The marketplaces are piled high with grain from the Black Sea and silphium from Africa. The philosophers are arguing in the colonnades. The hoplites are drilling in the dust. The mystery of the collapse has been solved by the resilience of the recovery. The phoenix has risen from the ash, and its feathers are brighter than before. In our final chapters, we will step back from the narrative history. We will put on the hat of the modern detective. We will ask, how do we know all this? We will look at the tools of archaeology that allowed us to write this story. And finally, we will ask the question that haunts us. Was the darkness necessary? Did civilization have to die so that it could be reborn? But for now, let the image of the archaic world settle in your mind. The white marble columns rising against a blue sky. The geometric order of the pottery. The shield wall of the phalanx. The night is over. The sun is high. Classical Greece has begun. We have spent the last 2 hours walking through a landscape of history. We have seen the palaces fall and the temples rise. We have watched the migrations of tribes and the birth of the alphabet. But before we close the book on the Dark Ages, we must pause and ask a fundamental question. A question that haunts every historian of the ancient world. How do we know any of this? The people of the Dark Ages left us no histories. They left us no biographies of their chieftains. They left us no tax records, no diaries, no letters. For 300 years the Greek voice was silent. So how can we claim to know what happened in the silence? The answer lies in the ground beneath our feet. The story of the Greek Dark Ages is not written in ink, it is written in dirt. It is a story pieced together, shard by shard, bone by bone, by the patient, obsessive work of modern archaeology. We're now going to step behind the curtain. We're going to look at the tools of the detective. The primary tool of the Dark Age archaeologist is pottery. It sounds mundane, broken cups and bowls. But to a historian, pottery is a clock. It is the metronome of the ancient world. In the 20th century, archaeologists excavating the cemetery of the Keramikos in Athens noticed something crucial. They found graves stacked on top of graves. By carefully noting which style of pot was found, in which layer, which style was below and which was above, they built a timeline. They saw the loose, sloppy lines of the sub-Mycenaean style give way to the tight circles of the proto-geometric. They saw the proto-geometric evolve into the complex patterns of the geometric. This sequence, this typology, allows us to date a site anywhere in the Greek world. If we find a specific type of cup in a ruined hut in Mycenae, and we know that cup was popular in Athens in 950 BCE, we know when that hut was inhabited. We can synchronise the clocks of the disparate villages, but pottery only tells us when. It doesn't tell us how people lived. For that, we need to look at the trash. In the Dark Ages, people threw their refuse into pits or left it on the floor of their abandoned houses. Today, bioarchaeologists sift this dirt through fine mesh screens. They find the microscopic evidence of life. They find animal bones. By analysing the cuts on the bones, they can tell us that the Dark Age Greeks ate mostly beef and pork, suggesting a pastoral lifestyle of herding, rather than the intensive agriculture of the Bronze Age. They find seeds. Charred grains of barley and lentils tell us what crops survived the climate shift. They find pollen. Cores drilled into the mud of Greek lakes reveal the changing landscape. The forests retreating as the climate dried, then returning as the population collapsed and the fields went fallow. But sometimes, the earth yields a secret that overturns everything we thought we knew. For decades, the standard narrative of the Dark Ages was one of abject poverty. We believed that after the palaces fell, Greece became a wasteland of mud huts and desperate subsistence, with no wealth, no contact with the outside world, and no monumental building. Then came Lefkandi. In 1980, a team of British and Greek archaeologists began digging on a hill called Tumba on the island of Euboea. They were excavating a cemetery when they hit something unexpected. A wall. It wasn't a small wall, it was massive. As they cleared the soil, the outline of a colossal building emerged. It was 150 feet long and 30 feet wide. It had a curved apse at one end. It was surrounded by a veranda of wooden posts, a foreshadowing of the great stone temples that would come centuries later. This building dated to roughly 950 BCE, the very heart of the deepest dark. According to the textbooks, the Greeks of this time were too poor and too disorganized to build something this large, and yet there it was. Inside the building, dug into the rock floor, they found two shafts. In one were the skeletons of 4 horses, animals of immense value, sacrificed to accompany their master. In the other shaft was the master himself. He was cremated, his ashes wrapped in a linen cloth, and placed inside a magnificent bronze amphora from Cyprus, a vessel that was already an antique when it was buried. Beside his urn lay an iron sword, a razor, and a whetstone. Next to him lay the skeleton of a woman. She was not cremated. She was buried with gold jewellery, a ring, hair coils, and a brassiere made of gold foil. But the most shocking detail was an iron knife found beside her head. It suggests a dark possibility, that she was sacrificed, perhaps unwillingly, to join her husband in the afterlife. This discovery, the heroine of Lefkandi, shattered the myth of the Dark Age equality. It proved that even in the darkest century there were elites. There were big men who could command labour, import luxury goods from the east, and be buried like the heroes of the Iliad. Efkandi taught us that the darkness was not uniform. While some regions had collapsed into total poverty, others were holding on. Euboea was a lighthouse, keeping the flame of complexity burning while the mainland slept. But archaeology also illuminates the lives of the poor. Travel with me to the southwest Peloponnese, to a ridge called Nicoria. In the Bronze Age, this was a wealthy town, part of the kingdom of Pylos. It is mentioned in the Linear B tablets, but after the collapse the town shrank into a village. Excavations here in the 1970s revealed the reality of Dark Age life. The archaeologists found the house of the village chieftain, the Basileus. If you compare it to the palace of Nestor just a few miles away, it is pathetic. It is a large apsidal hut made of mud, brick and thatch. It has a dirt floor. Animals probably slept in one end of the building. But if you look closer, you see the resilience. The chieftain's house was rebuilt several times over the centuries. It served as a community centre, a religious hall, and a storehouse. We found the remnants of feasts, bones of cattle and sheep, suggesting that the Basileus maintained his power by feeding his neighbours. Nicoria teaches us about continuity. The people there didn't vanish. They adapted. They took the stones of the ruined Bronze Age walls and used them to build fences for their goats. They kept the old names of the gods, even if they worshipped them in open-air sanctuaries instead of painted shrines. Modern science has given us even sharper tools. Radiocarbon dating allows us to date organic material, a piece of charcoal from a hearth, a bone from a grave, with a precision of a few decades. This has allowed us to anchor the floating timeline of the pottery styles to absolute dates. Metallurgical analysis allows us to trace the metal in a sword back to the specific mine it came from. We can see how the copper trade from Cyprus was cut off, and how the Greeks were forced to exploit their own inferior iron deposits. DNA analysis is the newest frontier. It is beginning to tell us about the movements of people. It helps us answer the Dorian question. Did a new population replace the old one, or did the same people just change their culture? The early results suggest a high degree of continuity. The invaders may have been a trickle, not a flood. The Greeks of the Classical Age were the biological descendants of the Mycenaeans. What does all this detective work tell us? It tells us that the term Dark Age is a misnomer. It reflects our own ignorance, not their reality. It was dark to us because we couldn't read their writing. But to the people living through it, it was simply life. It was a life of struggle, yes, a life of contraction. But it was not a void. Archaeology reveals a society that was fluid, experimental and incredibly tough. It was a time when the rigid, suffocating hierarchy of the palace system was broken, allowing for a kind of natural selection of ideas. The bad ideas, the over-specialised economy, the reliance on foreign tin, the top-down bureaucracy, died out. The good ideas, iron technology, the alphabet, the polis, the citizen soldier, survived and flourished. We have learned that civilization is fragile. A complex system can unravel with terrifying speed. A climate shift, a disruption in trade, a few bad harvests. That is all it takes to turn a palace into a ruin. But we have also learned that culture is resilient. You can burn the books, but you cannot burn the stories. You can destroy the cities, but you cannot destroy the need for community. The spade of the archaeologist has shown us that the roots of Western civilization did not die in 1200 BCE. They went dormant. They dug deep into the rocky soil, waiting for the winter to pass. And when the spring came, the growth was explosive. As we move to our final conclusion, we must look at the legacy of this winter. What did the Greeks learn in the dark, and why does their survival matter to us, sleeping in our comfortable beds 3,000 years later? The mystery has been unearthed, the shadows have been measured, the ghosts have been given a voice, and what they say is this: we survived. The sun has fully risen now. The shadows of the long night have retreated into the crevices of the hills. The noise of the classical world, the arguments of the assembly, the chant of the chorus, the clash of the hoplite line, is rising to a crescendo. But before we leave this story, let us sit for one final moment in the quiet. Let us look back at the 3 centuries of darkness we have traversed and ask, what did it all mean? We began this journey with a tragedy. We watched the smoke rise from the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos. We felt the horror of a civilization unravelling, the terror of a people watching their world end. But looking back from the vantage point of history, we can see a strange and difficult truth, a paradox that lies at the very heart of the Western experience. The Dark Age was not just a disaster, it was a necessity. The Bronze Age was magnificent, yes. It was a time of gold and giants, but it was also a cage. The palace system was a rigid top-down hierarchy, where the king owned everything, the land, the grain, the people. It was a society of subjects, not citizens. If the palaces had not burned, if the scribes had kept counting their sheep for another 1,000 years, Greece might have remained a frozen, ossified state, much like the unchanging kingdoms of the ancient Near East. The fire that destroyed the palaces also burned down the cage. It levelled the playing field. It stripped away the crushing weight of the bureaucracy and forced the Greeks to start over. In the poverty of the Iron Age village, stripped of kings and taxes, the individual began to matter. The farmer had to defend his own land. The smith had to forge his own tools. The bard had to sing his own songs. The concept of the polis, the community of equals, could only grow in the soil of the Dark Age. Democracy was not built on the foundations of the palaces, it was built on their ruins. So, perhaps we should not mourn the fall of the Bronze Age. Perhaps we should see it as a painful, terrible, but essential pruning. A forest fire that cleared the dead wood to allow new saplings to reach the light. What emerged from the ashes was not a restoration of the old world. It was something entirely new. The Greece that woke up in the 8th century was leaner, hungrier, and more dangerous than the Greece that fell in the 12th. It had traded the stability of the pyramid for the dynamism of the web. It inherited the language of the ancestors, but it wrote it down in a new alphabet that could question the gods. It inherited the myths of the heroes, but it transformed them into tragedies that questioned the morality of war. It inherited the iron of the earth, but it used it to arm the common man, not just the elite. And yet, for all our digging, for all our pottery shards and carbon dating, the Dark Ages remain a mystery. We still do not know exactly who the Sea Peoples were. We do not know the name of the genius who invented the Greek alphabet. We do not know the songs that were sung in the unlit halls of the 10th century before Homer wove them into gold. There are 300 years of human lives, of loves, fears, and dreams that are lost to us forever. They are the archaeological silence. But there is a comfort in this mystery. It reminds us that history is not a solid wall of facts. It is a flickering candle in a vast dark room. We see only what the light touches, but the darkness is full of life. The story of the Greek Dark Ages is ultimately a story of hope. It is a reminder that civilizations are fragile. They can break. The complex systems we rely on, trade, technology, writing, can vanish in a single lifetime. The watchers on the coast are always scanning the horizon, and sometimes the ships do come. But it is also a reminder that the human spirit is incredibly tough. When the cities burned, the people went to the hills. When the writing stopped, they memorized the stories. When the tin ran out, they mastered iron. They endured the hunger, the cold, and the isolation. They kept the fire burning in the hearth, shielding it with their hands against the wind, waiting for the storm to pass. And it did pass. The world we live in today, a world of written laws, of scientific inquiry, of democratic ideals, is the direct descendant of that survival. We are the heirs of the refugees who huddled in the ruins of Mycenae. We are the children of the Dark Age, so as you drift into sleep, let the map of the ancient world fade from your mind. Let the busy, noisy cities of the Classical Age dissolve. Let the marble temples turn back into timber and mud. Let the ships sail back into the mist. Return to the silence of the hills. The sun has set over the Aegean. The stars are wheeling overhead, the same stars that looked down on the ruins 3,000 years ago. The fire is dying down in the hearth. The bard has finished his song. The village is sleeping. The darkness is not empty. It is a resting place. A pause between breaths. A time to dream of what will come when the morning finally arrives. Rest now. The history is safe. The story continues. Good night.